In my previous episode, I talked about the start of the war in Puerto Rico and the bombardment of San Juan. Today, I will talk about the naval incidents off the coast of San Juan after said bombardment. The Americans maintained a naval blockade that lasted throughout the war. This time, the Spanish could do nothing but watch and wait to see what actions their opponents were going to take. In an attempt to change the situation, General Vallarino, commander of naval forces in Puerto Rico, orders an attempt to break the U.S. naval blockade by attacking the ship St. Paul. An interesting fact about the St. Paul was that its captain, Charles Sigsbee, was the captain of the USS Maine when it exploded in Havana Bay on February earlier that year. The naval forces in Puerto Rico had the following ships: the Isabel II, the General Concha, the Ponce de León, the Criollo, the Terror, and the Alfonso XIII. The latter two were part of Admiral Cervera's squadron that could not continue to Cuba with the rest of the fleet and remained in Puerto Rico a few days after the bombardment. On June 22nd, the St. Paul was almost 7 kilometers off the coast of San Juan. Throughout the morning, naval forces prepared for the attack. At about 12 p.m., the Isabel II leaves the port and begins to make some circuits in front of the city while exchanging fire with the St. Paul. Almost 2 hours later, the Terror comes out armed with torpedoes to attack the St. Paul. The Terror continued to fire its cannons as it moved to later launch the torpedoes. At around 2 p.m., one of the St. Paul's guns manages to fire a shot at the Terror, causing her rudder to be damaged. The captain of the Terror, Lieutenant Francisco de la Rocha, fearing that the ship was going to sink, turns back into the bay without being able to launch the torpedoes. The Isabel II moves to cover the retreat of the Terror until 2:30 p.m. when the ships are safe in the bay and the battle is over. Governor Macias classified the attack as irresponsible and suicidal against an enemy with superior weaponry. The damage to the St. Paul was minimal, and there were no deaths aboard, while the Terror suffered damage for the rest of the war, plus 5 wounded sailors and 2 dead sailors, who were buried that same day in the cemetery of San Juan. 6 days later, on June 28th, there was another conflict off the coast of San Juan that changed the course of the war. In mid-June, from Spain, they sent a cargo ship called the Antonio Lopez to Puerto Rico to provide more weapons for the city. At 4 in the morning, that day 28th, the ship arrives in Puerto Rico without the Americans noticing, circumventing the naval blockade. The bay entrance was bypassed because there was no light from the lighthouse, which suffered damage from the bombardment in May. In front of the beach near the town of Dorado, they turned to return to San Juan, but the American cruiser Yosemite began to fire on the Antonio Lopez. At 5:30 a.m., the Isabel II leaves the port to protect the Antonio Lopez. An hour later, the General Concha leaves as well. The Antonio Lopez turns right and runs aground near the beach. At 6 a.m., the Ponce de León leaves to assist its allies. Shots are also fired from the fortress of El Morro. At 8 a.m., the Ponce de León arrives at the Antonio Lopez, and the crew begins to help save the weapons cargo. The Yosemite continues firing, and some of its shots hit the Antonio Lopez, which begins to slowly sink. After 8:30 a.m., the other Spanish vessels retreat back to San Juan Bay, and the Yosemite also moves away, continuing its blockade. The weapons were taken to the town of Toa Baja to be transported by train to San Juan. During the entire incident, there were only 5 injured on the Spanish side, who later recovered from their injuries. The city was better armed than before, making it impossible to take. An interesting story that became legend during this incident was that while the weapons were being salvaged from the Antonio Lopez, a Spanish sailor saved the flag from the ship and was later given to the Servants of Mary in San Juan, which is a group of nuns who run a hospital, who, to this day, continue to wave a Spanish flag every time a Spanish ship enters the Bay of San Juan, such as the Juan Sebastián Elcano, which is the training ship of the Spanish Navy.